Did you know that some of the Pokemon we all know and love weren't supposed to exist at all? For some of our favorite pocket monsters, it was only thanks to happenstance, coincidence, or an unintended change of plans that allowed them to be included in the games, and the original plan for the various Pokemon games did not include them at all. And in this video, I am going to be covering 10 of these Pokemon that weren't supposed to exist. So this video is happening thanks in part to today's wonderful sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the place to go to learn how to do and become great at just about anything. And not only does this include stuff like video editing and illustration, but it also includes how to build and grow a career for yourself. Whether you want to learn how to take what you're doing and turn it into a career, or continue to grow the career you already have, Skillshare has got a ton of classes that cover a ton of valuable topics. For example, if you're just starting out, this class on creative confidence and silencing your inner critic is a great way to go. I personally see a lot of people who want to do YouTube, for instance, doubt themselves a lot simply because they're new and just starting out. So finding that confidence for yourself is a super important part of being successful. If you've already got something going for yourself though, Skillshare's got something for you too, such as this class on diversifying your income and earning passive income, which would obviously be a great skill for anyone to have. Those are just a couple of the many classes that are offered though, so if you want to take the next step in developing your skills and your career, you can use the link in the description below to join Skillshare today. And the first 1,000 people who do are gonna get a 1-month free trial, and you can't beat free. So go learn something new with Skillshare, which you can do for free if you're quick, and take yourself to the next level. And a big thank you to them for supporting the channel. Alright, let's begin with a rather big one, Lugia. Believe it or not, Lugia was not in the plans for Game Freak at all when Pokemon Gold and Silver were being created, and it is more or less thanks to Porygon that Lugia even exists at all. As many of you may know, Lugia was actually created for the anime instead of the games, and in particular was created for Pokemon the Movie 2000 by the anime's original head writer, Takeshi Shudo. However, in a personal blog post, which has recently been translated by Pokemon and video game historian Dr. Lava, Shudo explains how, for all intents and purposes, he was pretty much only able to create Lugia for the second movie because of the fallout of Electric Soldier Porygon. Electric Soldier Porygon is an infamous episode of the anime that many of you probably already know about, as it is extremely noteworthy due to being banned worldwide for causing widespread seizures amongst the children who first watched it when it aired in Japan. Shudo details how, because of this, the anime's executives were extremely preoccupied at this time, which gave Shudo more freedom to write the first Pokemon movie the way he wanted to, and when that movie proved to be extremely successful, he was pretty much given free rein to do whatever he wanted for the second movie as well, which of course included creating a whole entire Pokemon of his own in Lugia. So, without the controversy caused by Electric Soldier Porygon, Takeshi Shudo probably wouldn't have had the amount of freedom that he needed to create an entirely new Pokemon all his own for the second movie. And since Lugia was purely his creation and did not have any direct origins in the games, it was definitely not in the initial vision of the series for Lugia to exist at all. Another Pokemon that came into existence that was likely not originally intended to was Aerodactyl. If you've ever taken a good look at Aerodactyl, you would probably notice that it's a bit of an oddball when it comes to fossil Pokemon. It's the only fossil Pokemon that doesn't have its own counterpart as part of a duo or quartet, and it's the only fossil that isn't actually revived from a fossil, instead being revived from the old amber. In fact, Kanto already has a pair of fossils in Amistar and Kabutops, and Aerodactyl is seemingly just kinda shoved in there like it doesn't belong. Well, it doesn't exactly take a detective to realize that Aerodactyl is clearly inspired by Jurassic Park, a movie which came out during the time frame of Gen 1's development, and was extremely popular. The way that Aerodactyl is revived from the old amber, as mentioned, is lifted directly from the movie, where the dinosaurs there are also revived via DNA that has been preserved in old amber. So it very much seems to be the case that the initial plan was simply to just have Amistar and Kabutops, and they would be the fossil Pokemon duo for Kanto. But when Jurassic Park came out and swept everyone up in Dino Fever, Game Freak were probably inspired by this and decided to include one more fossil Pokemon in Red and Blue, since they had already conceived of the concept of fossil Pokemon to begin with, and that ultimately resulted in Aerodactyl. So if Jurassic Park hadn't come out literally smack dab in the middle of Gen 1's development, and it hadn't been the hit that it was, Aerodactyl would have likely never been a thing. Okay, let's go back to Johto and take a look at a trio of Pokemon this time: Larvitar, Pupitar, and Tyranitar. Despite being some of the most popular Johto Pokemon, and Pokemon in general, this family were not planned to be in the Johto games at all initially, and weren't even planned to be Pokemon. The story for these guys starts back in 1997, when a design very heavily resembling Tyranitar was featured on the cover of an issue of bi-monthly Game Review magazine in Japan. However, as the artist of this illustration, Ken Sugimori, mentioned in the magazine where he was interviewed, the cover illustration, including this Tyranitar design, was drawn specifically for the magazine cover and was inspired by Pokemon, but not meant to literally be from the Pokemon world. So while this is obviously Tyranitar, it wasn't intended to be a Pokemon at this time. Additionally, we also know that in the infamous Space World 97 demo of Pokemon Gold and Silver, Larvitar, Pupitar, and Tyranitar were not included in the demo's full Pokédex of Johto Pokemon. The interesting connection between these two events is that the magazine issue that featured the then original Tyranitar character design was from April of 1997, and the Gold and Silver demos, meanwhile, were shown off at Nintendo Space World in November of 1997. This means that this Tyranitar design was in existence at least 7 months before the demos would debut at Nintendo Space World, and yet they still did not feature Tyranitar in any way. In my opinion, that pretty definitively shows that Tyranitar was pretty specifically intended not to be a Pokemon, especially because another monster on this magazine cover that clearly resembles Hitmontop was in the beta demo, albeit with a much different beta design. So in short, Tyranitar was not intended to be in the picture at all initially, and therefore its pre-evolutions, Larvitar and Pupitar, weren't even a thought in Game Freak's minds since Tyranitar at the time was a standalone character. And it was only after who knows what that Game Freak eventually decided to include Tyranitar in the games, and as such, create its pre-evolutions. Another set of Johto Pokemon with a similar set of circumstances surrounding them are Ursaring and Teddiursa. As we have learned over the past few years, a ton of things changed about Pokemon Gold and Silver as development of the games went on, and that change extended to these two bear Pokemon, primarily in the sense that they weren't originally intended to exist at all. Not only were they not in the decks of the Space World demo, just like Tyranitar, but we can actually see, thanks to a beta sprite of Teddiursa, that it was initially meant to be the fire starter of the Johto region, and was a completely different Pokemon. By comparing this Teddy Ursa beta sprite to the original Firestarter Honoguma's sprite, it can clearly be seen that this fire-type bear Pokemon was eventually reworked into these two normal-type bears. But since Honoguma and its evolutions were indeed entirely different Pokemon at the time they existed, the only reason that Teddy Ursa even exists is because Honoguma just didn't work out. In fact, the idea that these Pokemon weren't supposed to exist is even more true for Ursaring, as it does not remotely resemble Honoguma's evolutions, meaning that it was only created because it was decided to rework Honoguma's design into Teddy Ursa, and at that point, Teddy Ursa needed a new evolution, and therefore Ursaring was created to better fit in with this new design. Meaning that these Pokemon are actually pretty fortunate to have even made the games at all. One of my most hated on Pokemon of all time is Stunfisk, and you would probably know that if you've watched my channel for a little while. I've discussed this derp of a Pokemon in depth before, and the fact that I have such a disdain for it is made even worse by the fact that it also wasn't supposed to exist. In an interview with Ken Sugimori that was published in Nintendo Dream magazine, and once again was translated by Dr. Lava, Sugimori reveals some of the origins of Stunfisk, and how originally it was an entirely different Pokemon altogether. Sugimori states that Stunfisk's type, color, and inspiration were all changed when it came time to balance Pokemon Black and White, which effectively means that it's only thanks to balancing the games that this abomination even came into existence. The original form of Stunfisk, as Sugimori states, was based on a goosefish instead of a flounder like the final design, it was blue in color instead of brown, and was water electric type instead of ground electric. For all we know, this Pokemon could have came out looking just as stupid as Stunfisk does, but there's no denying that this was such a different design that it was definitely just an entirely different Pokemon at that point. And the Stunfisk that we know only came about in order to balance the Gen 5 games. Next, we're going to turn our focus back to Kanto once again and talk about Kakuna and Beedrill. As has been revealed, and admittedly covered pretty well before, these two were not originally the evolutions of Weedle, and instead, the plan was to opt for something else entirely. Shared once upon a time on Game Freak's official website were these early sprites of the Weedle line. Now, Weedle, despite some differences, looks relatively the same here, but its evolutions are completely different Pokemon to what Weedle actually ended up evolving into. The first evolution was apparently named Kusanagi, with the final evolution not even receiving a name at all. Now, while these guys have been covered pretty extensively as I said, they're a pretty unique case as well, because it's not often that the evolutions of a Pokemon are changed entirely, instead of just simply updating the designs of those evolutions like is usually the case. Basically, whatever the plan was for Weedle initially, it did not include Kakuna or Beedrill, and personally, I think these Pokemon could have Metapod and Butterfree to thank for their existence. That is because these two families of Pokemon are quite clearly counterparts to one another, and I think that it was the idea of counterparts that possibly inspired Game Freak to ditch these Beetle-like designs and come up with something that mirrored the Caterpie line a little more closely instead. That was apparently not thought of until sometime later into development though, meaning that in a slightly different world, we would have never seen these two iconic Kanto bugs. With that said though, what do you guys think about all this? Are you glad these Pokemon ended up coming into existence? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to leave the video a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more if you're new. With that said, I'll be back very soon with another video, and until then, as always, thank you guys so much for watching this one. I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.